KCRW sponsors include UCLA Anderson School of Management, who teaches the next generation of leaders their values of sharing success, thinking fearlessly, and driving change. More information available at anderson.ucla.edu.
This is Josh Barrow, and welcome to Left, Right, and Center, your civilized yet provocative antidote to the self-contained opinion bubbles that dominate political debate. It's the third week of April, and this week the report is out. On Thursday, we all finally got to see Robert Mueller's report on his investigation, or most of the report anyway. Some information is redacted, for example, because its release could impair an ongoing prosecution, like the prosecution of Roger Stone. Volume 1 of the report looks at the question of whether there was any conspiracy or coordination between the Trump campaign and the Russian government related to Russian efforts to interfere in the 2016 election. Mueller writes that, quote, although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in its election interference activities. Volume 2 of the report looks at the president's efforts to interfere with the investigation itself, identifying 10 such episodes where he did. Trump asked FBI Director James Comey to, quote, let go the investigation into Michael Flynn. He fired James Comey. He directed White House counsel Don McGahn to fire Robert Mueller. He then pressured McGahn to say he'd never directed him to fire Mueller. About all of this, Mueller notes, quote, the president's efforts to influence the investigation were mostly unsuccessful, but that is largely because the persons who surrounded the president declined to carry out orders or accede to his requests, unquote. All of this raises the possibility that the president criminally obstructed justice, though Mueller declined to offer a conclusion either way on that question, in part out of the view that it is unfair to levy a criminal allegation against someone you're not actually going to indict. In a few minutes, we'll be joined by Ken White. Ken is a former federal prosecutor and my co-host on our sister show, All the President's Lawyers. He'll help us break down what this report means, whether we've seen all of it that we should, and what should be done next. Now let's bring in our Left, Right, and Center panel. As always, I'm your center, and I'm joined by Rich Lowry, editor of National Review, on the right. Christine Emba of The Washington Post is on the left. Hi, Rich and Christine.
Hey, Josh.
Hey.
So there was other news this week. Rich, what have you been watching?
Well, I was struck by the Bernie Sanders town hall on Fox News. He's the only Democratic presidential candidate who's gone and done one of these events with Fox so far. He had kind of break the partisan picket line to do it, since the Democratic Party doesn't want to have any debates with Fox, and he got a lot of criticism from the left from doing it. But I thought it was it was great television, a very notable event. Just it showed the verve and the ideological self-confidence that Bernie has. And this is why I like ideologues of all stripes, people who really know what they believe and sincerely believe it and have thought it through, so they can take it to any forum and be completely comfortable, as Sanders was, even though there was some quite tough questioning from the moderators. So to me, this just goes to, Nancy Pelosi has been at pains, understandably, to say that her party is not defined by the Democratic Socialists in her caucus. But the fact is that Democratic Socialists like Bernie Sanders and AOC are very good at what they do. They're good at making arguments. They're good at getting attention. And they have captured the imagination of millions of Democrats, and that's no small thing.
Christine, it's interesting that Bernie is the candidate who went and did the Fox town hall first, because Bernie represents an ideological move to the left for the party, but he also makes a case that he's actually better at appealing at Obama-Trump voters who have fallen away from the party than a more centrist candidate would be. He thinks that his left-wing economics message is actually quite appealing to a lot of people who have voted Republican in the past.
Bernie is an interesting figure, and in that, actually, he seems like he might be correct. One of the most startling moments of this Fox News town hall that I also enjoyed myself was when he was asked about Medicare for all, and when the audience was asked if any of them supported Medicare for all. And I think our Fox host hoped that, the audience would boo, but instead, lots of them clapped and cheered. Bernie has been, I think, and continues to plan to be, really insistent about, getting across the message that President Trump promised a lot of things, but hasn't delivered. And that, in fact, many of the things that, this white working class, these Trump voters are actually looking for, inexpensive health care, better social safety net, are things that his brand of democratic socialism, or perhaps even just the Democratic Party, might actually be willing to provide. And that's what he hopes will pull them over to the side. It also, I think, helps that he's, unfortunately, well, not unfortunately for him, but unfortunate that this is the case, that he is older and white and male and not alarming in the way that some other candidates might be to those voters.
Rich, one Fox News viewer who was not pleased about this town hall, and I would note the town hall did great ratings. It was widely watched, but the president seemed quite upset about it and was complaining that Fox was, which he seems to sort of view as his network, was giving all this time to Bernie.
Yeah, so and I think that's good for Fox, at least good for the news side. And Brett Baer, who was one of the co-hosts of this town hall, clapped back at the president and said, we want to hear from everyone, and why don't you come on as well? We'll be happy to interview you. Trump tends to do interviews with opinion folks on Fox. But this is just, it's a very small thing. We live in a bifurcated time and a partisan time. But it's just nice. It was even though Bernie at times it was very touchy, and Bernie was criticizing Fox in a way that made the host uncomfortable, and they were asking some questions that he felt was overly hostile that made him uncomfortable. But just the very act of going and arguing with the other side in that manner, in that forum, is a good thing for the broader health of our politics.
Christine, Rich refers to this as sort of crossing a picket line to go appear on Fox, and the Democratic National Committee had rejected a proposal by Fox to host a debate for all of the Democratic candidates. I see a distinction there. I think that allowing a news organization to host your debate is different from appearing on the news organization and addressing its viewers. I assume you think it's a good thing for Democrats to go on Fox and try to reach out, right?
I do think it's a good thing. I actually wrote when the DNC handed down that decision a couple of weeks ago that it was a bad idea. It is, in fact, important for presidential candidates who, as we say, want to be president of the entire nation to, yes, reach out to the other side, to talk to as many potential voters as possible, including the ones who might not be following them on MSNBC or Twitter. I also think that this is just, yes, a good look for the candidates. It does give them a little bit of that, going into the lion's den verve that will appeal to voters on the other side. They seem bold. They seem brave. That doesn't necessarily say that they're giving their imprimatur to Fox News as an organization, but that they're willing to go as far as they have to reach out to new voters. And that's a good thing. And we're noticing, of course, that many more Democrat presidential potential nominees are doing so. Bernie Sanders' town hall was this week. Amy Klobuchar just announced that she'll be going on Fox in May. Mayor Pete apparently is deep in conversation with Fox to have his own town hall or other event. He also already appeared on Fox News Sunday. So Democrats are reaching out, and I think that's only good for our democracy.
Christine, you mentioned Mayor Pete. I should just note for the for the benefit of the listening audience, I've mentioned my husband occasionally and the release of his emails in the DNC hack. My husband has now signed on to take Mayor Pete on as a client. So there is a little bit of involvement in our home in this campaign. I will still be watching the primary from afar, but just want to make sure that people know that. Christine, I know you had some broader thoughts on what had been seen with the Democratic primary field this week.
Yeah, I mean, not just this week, actually, but sort of in the same vein as Bernie Sanders going on Fox News for that town hall. I've just been interested in how the potential Democratic nominees are trying to reach out to Trump voters, past Trump voters, or prospective current ones. Mayor Pete has taken a slightly different tack, although in addition to being rather friendly to the Fox News viewer, he has, emphasized his religious values and his religious faith. Perhaps trying to win back some of those evangelicals who did vote for Trump and have been disappointed by his, shall we say, moral performance over the past 2 years. He is both talking up his own commitments and pushing back especially significantly on not just Trump, but his vice president, Mike Pence. And, we have seen some of that sort of religious and moral revulsion begin to come to play, especially in younger voters who, while they may identify as religious or even evangelical, are displeased with what the leaders of the Christian and evangelical movement seem to be saying, that seem at odds with the Christian teaching that they learned. And I think that, Mayor Pete, and also I think Harris has talked about her faith, Cory Booker frequently talks about his, they're trying to thread the line here, showing that, yes, they can relate to that segment of the population, but that they're a little bit different, and that's okay.
Rich, what do you make of the relationship between President Trump and the white evangelical community? I mean, as Christine notes, you see high-profile objections to the president and his morality, but overall in the polling, that is his core base. He enjoys very high support among white evangelicals, and then I think you see a split in the way that white evangelicals talk about the president. I think it's one thing to say, well, the president has a policy agenda that I agree with and that furthers my religious values, but then you get people like Michelle Bachmann saying that we will never have a more godly president than Donald Trump, which seems like it goes beyond making a deal for towards an end, but rather seeming to endorse the morality of a man who I think, I does not seem to behave in a godly manner.
Yeah, the way I see it, there's kind of a split between the high-profile leaders who go on TV, cable TV, and kind of exaggerate and make excuses and say things like Michelle Bachmann says, Jerry Falwell Jr. does this all the time as well, and what, at least in my experience, I take to be the view of kind of the median evangelical voter out there, which is this man is desperately flawed. They're fully aware of his flaws. They might be more entertained and amused by his flaws than Democrats are, obviously, but that they just think that he is delivering on their agenda and on a few issues, especially abortion, that are just key moral concerns of that constituency. So I don't see Mayor Pete at all, eating into evangelicals. I see kind of the talking about his faith just as more, one, as a way to kind of soften the edges. And prior to Trump, a key attribute of presidents who got elected, George W. Bush and Barack Obama, was going out of their way. Bush talking about compassionate conservatism, Obama talking about his faith and how there's no red and blue America, to kind of soften their edges and not be hated and feared by the other side, at least not until they got elected. And Trump didn't do that, but I think that's sort of an obvious play. And I see Buttigieg talking about his faith playing more of that role. Two, let's not forget that the Democratic electorate is not, solely, white, progressive, secular voters. Especially African American voters are going to want to hear about the faith of these candidates and their faith stories. So it's also very important for that constituency, and maybe a reason why Cory Booker at the moment might be an undervalued asset in the Democratic primaries. Things have to break right for him, and some other people need to fall away. But he even though he's sitting at 1% of whatever it is, he might have a lot of upside potential, in part because faith is absolutely crucial to his message and might play very well in a place like South Carolina.
One thing I've been watching this week is Trump's continued efforts to get some loyalists on the board of the Federal Reserve. And as Trump does, he has left his designees for these positions sort of out there twisting in the wind politically. Former fast food executive Herman Cain does not appear to have enough support to be confirmed to the Fed board. 4 Republicans in the Senate have announced their opposition to his appointment, citing past claims of sexual harassment and his lack of traditional qualifications for the job. Steve Moore, who is a somewhat less untraditional pick for the Fed, also has been hitting some difficulty in his conversations up on Capitol Hill, although I think he has a higher chance of confirmation if that nomination actually proceeds. Rich, I sort of want to get a sense of the Kremlinology here, because you see some of these stories coming out basically making it unclear what the White House's level of commitment is to these 2 picks. You even had Larry Kudlow, who runs the National Economic Council in the White House, floating some additional names of people that the president could nominate, if not these people. Is the president committed to getting Herman Cain and Steve Moore onto the Fed board? And because that's, the Fed is traditionally a pretty, staid organization run by economists. It would no longer be very staid if these people got on the Fed board.
I see the Herman Cain thing as they're giving him a graceful way out by saying they're still with him, but clearly the writing is on the wall and he would not get confirmed by the Senate. I see Steve Moore as a more serious figure. I'm conflicted about Steve, as I mentioned a week or 2 ago, because I've been friendly with him for a very long time. But the problem with Steve is just the lack of really a well-formed, clear, and consistent view of monetary policy, which would be important. And I think what the Senate wants to guard against is just with, especially someone like Herman Cain, you get a couple of these guys on, and the part of the appeal to Trump, obviously, is just being able to call them up and tell them what to do, which doesn't accord with the Fed's traditional independence, obviously.
Christina, a funny thing about this is that the president gets to pick people to put on the Fed board, and the Senate gets to confirm them. And so the president's instinct that he ought to have some influence over the policy the Fed makes through his appointments to the Fed, I think, is not a crazy one, even though the way he's gone about this, I think, has been inappropriate. But I think, should presidents be thinking more about that? The Fed has basically operated in this consensus that I think has at times overemphasized inflation and has allowed unemployment to run too high. Should there be more of a level of political control over the Fed, with presidents really thinking about what monetary policy do I want made, and therefore who should I put on the board?
I mean, potentially, yes. After all, the Fed is a government organization and has great impact on our fiscal lives. But, the one thing you want to think about, at least at this point in time, is for the president to appoint someone knowledgeable to the Fed and perhaps have his opinions influence its functioning would mean that the president would have to know something about economics and actually know some people who might know enough about economics to be appointed to the Fed. And that just does not seem to be the case, frankly, with either of these two appointees. I mean, Herman Cain himself said that he should be on the board of the Fed to counteract its professor standard, as though we don't want economics professors helping to set our economic policy. And Stephen Moore has made quite a number of statements in the past that, while, yes, he does have an economic background, don't necessarily suggest that he is the right man for the job right now. I'm all for the president having some influence on economic policy, but I just want the president to know something about economic policy first.
I think Fed policy is one of these areas where obviously Trump, many things are not thought through very carefully or in any detail, but where directionally he is righter than what the conventional wisdom was in the Republican Party, which was this obsession with the Fed being really tight, even after a major financial crisis. And I think Trump has kind of helped. Well, one, facts and the great inflation that was predicted by many conservative economists because the Fed was supposedly too loose. That didn't happen, and also Trump. Have sort of broken up that consensus, and maybe they'll be coalescing around a more rational view of Fed policy.
Yeah, it pains me to say this, but I think the president's core critique around monetary policy right now, which is that we do not have a threat of high inflation and that there is plenty of room for the Fed to continue to allow the economy to heat, that they don't need to be raising rates right now, that would just unduly dampen the job market. I think that's actually correct. I don't love the president badgering the Fed to take specific actions, because you could imagine a future situation where leaving interest rates low would be problematic, would cause inflation, but a president might want it for short-term economic benefit. That said, we're not in that situation. I think his critique is basically correct. It's just unfortunate the way he's going about it. Let's take a break. I will be back with Rich Lowry of National Review and Christine Emba of The Washington Post to talk about the Mueller report. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
What do you think? Share your thoughts on today's show on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW and download the KCRW app to listen to Left, Right, and Center on demand.
On the newest episode of Nocturne. There's really nothing else like late-night call-in shows on the radio. Other humans in real time, just chatting. You're separated by space, but they're there with you, anywhere the radio waves can reach you.
It is really remarkable to know that they are there, thousands of miles away, in the dark, shooting kangaroos, but listening to your program.
Find Nocturne wherever you listen to podcasts.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm Josh Barrow of New York Magazine. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Christine Emba, columnist at The Washington Post. You may have heard about this government report that came out this week. The former FBI director Robert Mueller had been conducting this investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and matters arising therefrom. And now the report is out in 2 volumes, offering something for everyone. The first volume is a victory for the president. It says Mueller's investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated with Russia in its election interference activities. The report also lets the air out of some other stories. It says Michael Cohen never went to Prague, as the Steele dossier claimed he had done, to act as an intermediary to the Russians. It says Mueller did not establish that a change to the 2016 Republican Party platform that softened language about defending Ukraine from Russia was undertaken either at Trump's behest or at Russia's. And it downplays Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak's Zelig-like presence around Trump campaign officials, saying, for example, that Kislyak's interactions with Trump officials at an April 2016 foreign policy speech were, quote, brief, public, and non-substantive. The second volume of the report is considerably more damaging for the president. It describes his extensive but mostly unsuccessful efforts to impede the investigation. The factual description of those efforts is followed by a legal analysis, which argues that when a president uses his constitutional powers to interfere with an investigation for a corrupt purpose, he may be committing criminal obstruction of justice. All that said, Mueller declined to make a traditional prosecutorial recommendation, and as we know from his letters, Attorney General Bill Barr and Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein disagree with Mueller's interpretation of the facts and the law. They say Mueller's report does not establish that the president committed an obstruction crime. To discuss all that, we're joined now by Ken White. Ken is a criminal defense attorney and former federal prosecutor, and he's my co-host on our sister show, All the President's Lawyers. Hello, Ken.
Hello, Josh.
So, is this report a vindication for the president?
It's, I would say, a partial vindication. So the first half of the report does say what Barr suggested, that the special counsel did not find enough evidence to say that anyone conspired with Russians attempting to interfere with our 2016 election. But it's not exactly a complete moral or social or political vindication there in Volume 1, because it makes it fairly clear that there was a strong Russian effort to interfere with the election and that members of the Trump campaign were willing and even eager to reap some of the benefits, even if they did not form any sort of criminal agreement. There's even a suggestion that there was a potential charge out there, and that would be against people who attended the infamous June 9th meeting at Trump Tower to talk about Russian dirt, but that the special counsel thought he couldn't prove intent of the people there, the requisite intent that they knew they would be breaking laws prohibiting receiving things of value towards a campaign from a foreign agent. Section 2, Volume 2, is much less of a vindication. In this, which is really remarkably thorough and detailed, so much so that I don't think it's fair to say anyone has a full grasp on it within the last 24 hours since it's come out, what he does is he lays out his case. Even though he fails to recommend prosecution, the message to those familiar with how prosecutors write is fairly clear that he thinks that there are colorable cases here. His main reason for not straight up saying that the President of the United States should be charged with a crime or should be indicted is what he says the circumstances that he is in. He is, of course, limited by a Department of Justice memo that says that a sitting president can't be indicted. And because of that, what he says is, normally if I said someone committed a crime and that they should be charged with it, there is a remedy for them. They can demand to go to trial. They can be vindicated through the legal process. But there's no such vindication potential if I simply say it in a report like this and accuse them. Now, I don't find that explanation terribly convincing, given that after he says it, he then goes and lays out a lot of rather damaging, rather embarrassing evidence about the things that the president and the president's advisors did. But what he lays out is a case that might be sufficient if members of Congress decide to be a high crime and misdemeanor, although there may be no appetite to go down that road. And I think many prosecutors would see in other circumstances as enough to bring obstruction of justice charges.
So, Rich, isn't it kind of funny to be talking about this as a vindication for the president? I mean, obviously, the report says that he didn't do, and in other cases says that it cannot establish that he did, things that people thought that he or people around him in the campaign might have done. It is not the absolute worst-case scenario for the president. But it seems to me like this is a report that lays out a lot of bad actions and some things that are probably criminal actions. It's a little weird that the president's out there celebrating this as a vindication.
Well, I think the investigation ended up running in kind of the well-worn ruts of special counsel investigations, which even if they don't find the underlying offense, and this one didn't, they go to process crimes. And the Mueller report just does that on a gigantic scale. Now, Volume 1 on Russia collusion is a vindication for the president. The underlying offense isn't there. It's not just that there isn't a criminal offense of collusion. There's not coordination either. Carter Page, who was such a focus for so long, there were these FISA applications where the FBI represented to the FISA court that he was that they had probable cause to believe that he was an agent of a foreign power that was part of a conspiracy with Russia. There's nothing new about Carter Page. There's nothing particularly damning about Carter Page. All the others, most of the others who would have been mostly directly involved with WikiLeaks or Russia or represented themselves as such were braggarts and liars, exaggerating their importance. And Paul Manafort, who's kind of the sleaziest and shadiest character who appears in Volume 1, was all about himself. He viewed his role in the Trump campaign not as a perch to forge a grand conspiracy with Russia, but just to get even richer and to, quote-unquote, make himself whole with his various Ukrainian businesses and associates. So Volume 2, though, it's problematic. And obviously, even before you reach the legal question, it's a damning portrayal of this presidency. You know, the president is dishonest. He demands dishonesty from people around them, creating a moral dilemma for them to either lie on his behalf or to defy him. And if he had his druthers, by the end, he just would have shut down this investigation. But people around him refused to take his orders or ignored him, and he didn't follow through. So that's the ultimate ambiguity here. There are many things that he wanted to do, at least briefly, but he didn't do and didn't happen. And does that really constitute a crime? You know, did he really order Don McGahn to fire Mueller if he didn't actually follow through with it? And in fact, you know, the next day or whenever it was when he saw McCann, after McCann decided not to do this, he doesn't even bring it up again. So this goes to just the central ambivalence between kind of the personal Trump who's raging, who hates this investigation for various reasons, and kind of the official presidency that is cooperating with this investigation, letting the White House counsel talk to Mueller and hand over all his notes. And it was true of all sorts of other people in the White House and over 1 million documents. So that's why ultimately I think Barr makes the right call, because at the end of the day, the investigation went on. There was cooperation from the White House, even though the president had impure thoughts and intentions about the investigation all along.
I want to come back to Ken in a second on that question of, you know, if Trump didn't follow through and didn't pay that close attention, did he really intend to obstruct justice? But first, I want to bring in Christine, and I want to ask about the way Democrats have been reacting to this report, because I think there's been a temptation to go directly to Volume 2. In fact, I was on Press Play on Thursday with Congressman Ted Lieu, who said that he hadn't even read Volume 1 yet. He started with Volume 2, and Volume 2 is the more damaging part for the president. It does seem like an important thing to acknowledge that Mueller did not establish conspiracy or coordination, and that some of the things that people thought might have happened, like Michael Cohen going to Prague, apparently did not happen. The some of the most damaging allegations about what the president had been up to with Russia seem not to have been true.
Sure, and you can say that perhaps. Well, you can't, actually. The president has tried to say that this report is an exoneration, but after these more fully apparent documents have been released, even he's moved from saying exoneration to calling it the crazy Mueller report and trying to downplay it. It's not really a win, and I think even he knows this. Yes, I think that Part 2 is perhaps the most obviously damaging to the president, because it does expose the White House for the sort of venal, confused, and morally, not even morally ambiguous, frankly, morally problematized place that it is. It's remarkable. It's far past Nixon in the level of sort of lies and calumny that were apparently and are apparently a constant feature of the place. But Part 1, I think, is actually incredibly important, and Democrats will need to turn their attention to that, especially as 2020 approaches. Because it really does lay out, you know, the asterisk that has to be placed next to the 2016 election, and that we can hopefully try and move away from 2020. The fact that Russia did, in fact, interfere in our election process. They did so successfully, and the fallout from that interference is still continuing today. In the polarization of our debate, in the fact that we're still arguing about who won in this damning for all of us report, means that, yes, someone has succeeded in tearing down elements of our democracy that we thought could never go.
Ken, I want to ask you about that intent issue. And I saw some people after Attorney General Barr gave his press conference yesterday and was talking, among other things, about the president's mental state and his, the extraordinary situation that he was placed in and how he felt about it. And a lot of people were basically like, who cares how the president feels? But it seems like the answer is that in order to establish a crime of obstruction of justice, it's important to show that the person who you might be charging acted with a corrupt purpose. To interfere with an investigation. The intent is really important. You have to get inside the president's head. Is it difficult to establish that the president had the requisite intent here to be guilty of a crime? Or is, the thing that Richard points out there, is that important? If the president was sort of just ranting and raving and didn't even follow up to see if anybody had actually fired the special prosecutor, does that indicate that he did not have an intent to interfere with the investigation?
Well, it's all evidence one way or the other, and you always prove intent through circumstantial evidence and through the things the person has said. But what I've been pointing out for a while is that Trump, through his long-term erratic, boisterous, insulting, and generally bizarre behavior, has laid down a fairly effective defense to allegations that he had specific intent at any given time. Because the mere fact he was saying these things, we see, doesn't necessarily mean he means them or is going to do anything about them. So do I think he could have had corrupt intent? Of course. Would it be easy to prove? No, it would not, given all the different sort of things that he said. But what I find remarkable, Josh, about the whole volume 2 of this report is how it would not be there and how much shorter this would have been if the president just would have taken some good advice coming from all people, Chris Christie, who said that, you can't shorten an investigation, but you can make it longer and, in polite terms, sit down and shut up. And volume 2 doesn't exist if he had taken that advice. And that is fairly common.
It's 1,000 times yes. Some of us who are Trump skeptical learned from the 2016 campaign. Okay, the conventional advice is not always correct. The quote-unquote smart advice is not always correct. In this case, it was completely correct. And all he had to do was just sit. He knew he hadn't colluded with Russia, which was one reason he was raging about the investigation and one reason he fired James Comey and got the whole Volume 2 part of it started. But if he just shut up and sat tight, he would have had a total exoneration. As Ken says, Volume 2 wouldn't have existed. And the amazing thing is that everyone around the president knew this. Everyone. It was from Chris Christie. It was Corey Lewandowski, who gets this bizarre message from Trump. He's supposed to deliver to Sessions to curtail the investigation just to forward-looking election interference. Corey puts it in a safe, and in the meeting he's supposed to have with Sessions doesn't come off. And he's like, well, I don't want to do this. I'm going to let Rick Dearborn, this longtime aide who worked for Sessions for a long time, I'm going to let Rick do it. And Rick's like, I'm not going to do that. And that's just that fact pattern is repeated over and over again. And it's not just like the pros and the adults in the room that realize that all these things are kind of harebrained schemes that they shouldn't follow up with. It's literally everyone down to Corey Lewandowski.
But so isn't that, I think that's a theme of both volumes of the report, is the president's terrible judgment. Going back to what you said about Paul Manafort, that, Paul Manafort's dealings with Russian associates in the campaign weren't about some conspiracy with Trump. They were about Paul Manafort trying to enrich himself. The defense here is that the president just allowed himself to be used by a criminal Kremlin apparatchik for his own financial purposes. That's the exculpatory story.
When he realizes that's happening, he fires him and gets rid of him. But another, just going to the judgment, the Trump Tower meeting, there's a line in there where Paul Manafort says, look, guys, this isn't going to produce anything. We got to be really careful about this meeting. So Paul Manafort, the shadiest guy in the room, had better judgment than the amateurish people around him.
Christine, what should Democrats do with this report now? Obviously, there's one reference in the report to a reason that Mueller puts forward about why he's not making a prosecutorial recommendation is that it could interfere with constitutional mechanisms to address presidential misconduct, which is to say impeachment. Should Democrats be talking about impeachment?
Well, Democrats are already talking about impeachment, much to, frankly, my chagrin. I think that what Democrats should do is maybe step back and take a deep breath. First of all, this report is 448 pages long. There's still quite a bit of redaction. Maybe they can, and I think some have already subpoenaed the slightly less redacted version and really get a grasp on what exactly happened here. Basically that our president is a corrupt liar and his associates are tripping all over themselves not to help him because once upon a time, a couple of them watched All the President's Men and realized that, oh, this could be a problem. But there's so much in this report that just underlines, yes, how unsuitable Donald Trump is to be president, that this is ammunition that could be used for 2020 and beyond. There's a lot to talk about here, whether it's Russia, whether it's the role of the presidency, whether it's what we just, think about these legal theories of intent and the president's immunity from indictment. There's a lot of space to debate and make the facts known before jumping to any conclusions or divisive actions like impeachment.
Rich, setting aside the political questions and the fact that the Senate obviously would not remove the president, would it be improper to impeach a president over the sort of behavior described in Volume 2 of this report?
I think you can make an impeachable case out of it. It's just there's always, with impeachment, since it's inherently a political process, there's always the political judgment. And I think Nancy Pelosi is correct that it would be a mistake for the party to go down this route. And bad, I think, for every institution. Congress would end up not looking great because you'd have this impeachment vote. And then we'd go to the Senate for a trial that I imagine would just be a complete joke. But the question is, will she get backed down by the left? And even if she is backed down by the left, the question is, are there enough votes for impeachment among the moderates of the caucus to actually pass counts of impeachment? But this is a theme of mine that repeated throughout the show, throughout this whole process is, this is basically because it would be crazy to indict the president for all sorts of reasons. This was never really a legal question, the obstruction stuff. It was an abuse of power question. It was an impeachment question. I just don't think the executive branch should be queuing up an impeachment inquiry for the legislative branch. That's not how it's supposed to work. This should have been Jerry Nadler's work from the beginning, and he never would have gotten this kind of level of cooperation, this level of detail. But Congress easily could have developed an impeachment case on its own on firing Comey, or the McGahn asking McGahn to fire Mueller, which was in the New York Times. Most of this was in the press, and that's the way the process should work from the beginning, in my view.
Ken, just quickly want to ask you about next steps. What else we should expect? The redactions in the report, should we be concerned about that any of them are excessive? Is there more that ought to be seen publicly there? And then also, there's this issue of criminal referrals. We know that Robert Mueller made 14 criminal referrals to other prosecutorial offices, and only 2 of those have turned into public indictments, of Michael Cohen and Greg Craig. Are there more cases that we should expect to come down from that?
Well, 2 parts to the answer. The first part is that I think the way the report is structured, how thorough it is, and where the redactions occur are not consistent with worrying that the redactions have been done to conceal major misdoings by the president. It just doesn't work with the structure of the report and where the redactions are. It's more consistent with it genuinely being about continuing investigations more directly at other people. But it does suggest there are ongoing investigations and cases, and it's hard to tell how much of that is what we know about already, like Roger Stone, like Internet Research Agency, and how much other juicy stuff there is out there. And I don't think we're going to know for a while, because it's the nature of these things to take time.
Ken White is a criminal defense attorney and my co-host on All the President's Lawyers. Ken, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Josh.
I've been talking with Christine Emba of The Washington Post and Rich Lowry of National Review. We will be back with Igor Volsky to talk about guns. You're listening to Left, Right, and Center.
Join the conversation on our Facebook page or tweet us at LRCKCRW. Stream all episodes of Left, Right, and Center and other great shows at kcrw.com/podcasts.
Hey, it's Ken White. 10 years ago, would you have thought that White House legal strategy would be a dinner table topic? Keep up. Every week, join me and Josh Barrow, hosts of KCRW's Left, Right, and Center, for LRC Presents All the President's Lawyers. We're here to help everyone navigate the legal dramas dominating politics today. Get it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
Back again with Left, Right, and Center. I'm your host, Josh Barrow. On the right is Rich Lowry, editor of National Review. On the left is Christine Emba, columnist at The Washington Post. And we're now joined by Igor Volsky, who's the founder and executive director of the gun control organization Guns Down America. He's written a book calling for Democrats to take a more aggressive political approach on gun control. The book is called Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns. Hello, Igor.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. So you hear a lot of politicians who favor new restrictions and requirements around gun ownership, and they caveat their comments saying things like, we're not trying to take your guns away. You open this book by saying that you do want to take people's guns away. So whose guns and why? What's your vision about why and how to have fewer guns in America?
Well, to be clear, I don't think militarized weapons should be in civilian hands. It's just that simple. That's really a recent trend that the gun industry began in the late 80s, early 90s. You know, they're constantly facing this problem of how do we market new products to an already ever-saturated market, and their solution to that was assault rifles and all kinds of militarized pistols, and that's killing a lot of people every single day. So I think certain weapons should no longer be produced, number one, and then I also argue that we really need to raise the standard of gun ownership in America. And what I mean by that is that if you want to have a gun, you should go out, get a license, register that firearm, prove to your community and to your neighbors that you could use that firearm responsibly.
So I feel like countries tend to take one of two broad approaches to gun regulation. Everyone's trying to ensure that people who are going to use guns responsibly can have them, but the people who are going to use them irresponsibly should not have them. And you have to err on the side of one of those. You can do something like in Japan, for example, where you really err on the side of keeping guns out of the hands of dangerous people, and then you need a totally discretionary license from the government to own a gun. And then the consequence is that a lot of people who would not have done anything bad with the gun are not able to get that license, and they don't get to own a gun. The alternative is you can have a system that errs on the side of the right to gun ownership, and where there's a fairly high bar for the government to show that somebody ought not to be able to own a gun. And then a lot of people slip through the cracks because there are a lot of people that you can't tell in advance that they're going to misuse the gun, and they have a right to gun ownership. And so I guess my question is, doesn't the Second Amendment require the United States to have the second sort of approach where there's a presumption that you're entitled to own a gun? And then, you know, regardless of what kind of licensing regime you have, doesn't that mean that we're still going to have a country with lots of guns out there that often end up in the hands of people who misuse them?
Yeah, we are. I mean, we have 393 million guns in circulation right now. That's more guns than people. You have to think, what are you going to do with those guns already in circulations? I write in the book that you have to regulate them in the same way that machine guns are currently regulated. There's about 100,000 machine guns in circulation, but you got to get a special license. You got to register that machine gun. And so you rarely hear about shootings that happen with machine guns. But to your first point, you know, I argue that we have to raise the standard, but also change the environment in which guns are produced and guns are purchased. Change the environment for everybody. Because look, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to divide the world into good guys and dangerous people, particularly in a country, Josh, where 2/3 of our gun deaths are suicides. So my argument is, if you make guns harder to get for everybody, you make everyone safer.
Christine, this is an argument that Democrats, I think, have been reluctant to make so explicitly in the past.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's because Democrats, unfortunately, are acclimated to the political climate, which seems to be telling us that anything that one says about, you know, removing guns from people's possession, for instance, or obstructing the ways that people can get guns is an impingement on our freedom. But the research that we have, the research that the NRA has not blocked us from undertaking through its lobbying efforts, does say that, yes, simply having a gun in your possession is the most dangerous of all. And this, I think, is where personal experience and the insights of individuals can have the most effect on the political conversation happening.
Rich, I feel like there has been this shift toward talking about what Igor cites there, which is that most gun deaths are suicides and that a policy goal of gun regulation ought to be to reduce suicides. Is there an appropriate conservative policy response that focuses on that? I mean, do you take seriously the findings that higher levels of gun ownership lead to not just more gun suicide deaths, but more suicide deaths in total? And is there anything the government ought to do about that?
I don't think that's going to happen in the country with the Second Amendment. The fact is, most people are killed by guns that aren't these militarized long arms, but handguns. And if you're really going to substantially reduce the stock of guns in America, you have to go after handguns. You have to go after semi-automatic guns, which are the vast majority of guns and aren't exotic technology. They're technology that has existed for about a century. And I just don't think you can do that under our current Constitution, which guarantees the individual right to bear arms.
Igor, what's your argument there about handguns? I mean, you focus on military-style rifles, and you see a lot of high-profile crimes committed with them. But Rich is right that most gun crime is committed with handguns. Are you going to try to make it much harder for people to own a handgun?
Well, Rich is absolutely right that handguns are the problem, and they're particularly a problem for white men in rural areas who are now using those guns to kill themselves and are leaving all kinds of devastation in their wake, in their families, and in their communities. And again, this is why I argue guns should be harder to get, all kinds of guns. And in terms of the Second Amendment, I mean, you just look at what the late Justice Scalia said in Heller about the Second Amendment. He said that right is not absolute, that the government has a level of discretion in how it regulates that right. And so licensing, for instance, has been challenged in the courts. It has never come up to the Supreme Court. But those laws, and there's about 10 states that have a licensing system, those laws have been upheld.
Can you talk in a little more detail about what licensing would entail? How hard would it be to get one of those licenses?
So the model here is probably Massachusetts. And what you have to do in Massachusetts, if you want a gun, you go to your local police department or your sheriff's office. You get fingerprinted. You get a written test. You get a field test. You go through a much more comprehensive background check because, as we know, the NICS system is nowhere near comprehensive, which is, by the way, why the woman who traveled from Miami to here in Columbine was able to purchase a long gun, passed the background check to purchase that long gun, by the way, and then went on to terrorize the community on the 20th anniversary of Columbine. We need a deeper background check system. Licensing does that. Then there's also a waiting period, which is something that also would have helped the situation in Columbine that we saw several days ago. And then if you go through all of that and you pass, you're able to obtain a firearm. And what they've seen in Massachusetts, by the way, is significant reductions in both gun homicides, but also gun suicides, because what we know, those suicides happen during a short period of personal crisis. You extend the time between when you want a gun and when you can obtain a gun. And as we've seen, you can save a lot of lives.
Christine, what have you made of the way that this is being discussed in the Democratic presidential primary? You had Eric Swalwell, congressman from the Bay Area, announcing a presidential campaign that's going to be heavily centered around gun control. And I think you've seen this as a big issue in a lot of congressional races, but it's not clear to me that it's been a top issue for most of the candidates in the presidential primary.
Sure. And as I said, I think it's not a top issue for a lot of candidates because there's still that visceral feeling that if you talk too much about guns, you're going to somehow offend a large proportion of the American population. That said, as we've seen in the last year, especially, with the activism after the Parkland shooting, guns and gun control are on people's minds. We're beginning to wake up to the fact that, we seem to have a mass shooting almost every other day. The fact that, as someone who works in a newsroom, we sometimes have to ask ourselves, which shooting are you referring to? Which one was that again? Is absurd and makes America exceptional in an incredibly negative way in the rest of the world. That said, I do think that Democratic candidates would do well to get a little closer to the ground when it comes to talking about guns and gun control. It's one thing to talk about semi-automatic rifles and to say that, mass killings are bad, and another to talk to a citizen who has a gun for, whatever reason, whether it's protection, whether they use it to shoot the raccoons in their yard, whether it's a family heirloom, and, see what that means to them before making huge pronouncements.
Rich, do you worry that the politics of guns have shifted the way we used to talk about this issue, at least until about a couple of years ago, was basically that it was an asymmetric issue, that opponents of gun control tended to care deeply about the issue and vote on it and organize around it. And that was why policies, even if they polled pretty well, did not end up being political winners for advocates of gun control. Now you've seen this immense upsurge in activism on the pro-gun control side. Has the issue gotten more balanced in terms of its political impact?
I don't think so. At least not that I've seen any evidence of. I think this is still a winner for Republicans just in sheer political terms. I think it, especially in presidential elections, is a huge benefit to Republicans. And if Democrats were actually more forthright about sweeping plans to crimp gun ownership or ban entire categories of guns beyond just the quote-unquote assault weapons ban, which just has to do with cosmetic features, the politics would be even worse for Democrats.
Igor, what do you make of that, and what do you hear when you talk with candidates about the sorts of ideas that you float in your book?
Yeah, I think that's just not the reality in 2019. Let's first look at poll numbers. 70% of Americans believe we already have a licensing system. 89% of Americans want to see a licensing system once they're told we don't actually have one. It's also incredibly popular among young people. Recent Harvard Kennedy polls found that 79% of young people believe that you should have a license for a gun like you have a license to drive a car. But really, the conversation has also shifted significantly since Parkland. The fact that you had 40 companies break ties with the NRA, recognizing that there's a real danger in 2018 and 2019 for your brand to be associated with the gun lobby. The fact that we saw a surge of registration from young people in 2018, many of them voting on the gun issue. By the way, one pollster called the gun issue this generation's 9/11. So the politics are really changing, and we're in this place where the American people are ahead of the politicians. And I argue in the book that the more we can do to close that gap, Josh, the more lives we will save. But this notion that a lot of Democrats and progressives had in the 90s that if you talk about guns, you lose, it's just not true.
So what's the evidence that the politics have shifted? Because as long as I can remember, it's been the case that a lot, as you describe, a lot of gun restriction measures, things like licensing, poll extremely well. But a few years back, where you are in Colorado today, you had gun restrictions that moved through the legislature that led to recalls of Democrats in swing seats, and the recalls were successful. Republicans took back control of a house of the Colorado legislature over the gun control issue, and it took years for Democrats to get the majority back. So are there electoral results that you're looking at where you see that this issue has shifted?
Well, and here in Colorado, they just passed a red flag law, right? So yes, look, this is going to be certainly a challenge, but even in a state like Colorado that has high gun ownership, and I might add, as a result, has a very high firearm suicide rate, the politics are, in fact, changing. Nationally, they're changing as well. The fact that you had politicians in this last midterm elections in places like Texas and elsewhere where Democrats don't usually talk about guns, actually talk about guns. The fact that you've had dozens of House members, I believe it's some 40, maybe even 60 House members lose their seats. These are House members who received money from the NRA and were replaced by politicians who did not receive money from the NRA, I think shows a real trend. But look, the real trends are two different things. One is where young people are, and how they see the issue differently. And the second is how gun ownership itself is really shrinking in the United States. You have about 30% of households that own guns. That number is just going to decline. And so the trends are moving towards gun control. I argue that, again, the sooner we get there, the more lives we will save.
Igor Volsky is the founder and executive director of the organization Guns Down America. His book is called Guns Down: How to Defeat the NRA and Build a Safer Future with Fewer Guns. Thanks for joining us, Igor.
Thank you, Josh.
We have reached that time once again for our famed left, right, and center rants featuring pet peeves from across the political spectrum. Christine Emba, what's your rant?
So this may be a little bit controversial, but my rant is about Game of Thrones. Look, don't get me wrong, I like a good fantasy novel. In fact, if you'd read my Lord of the Rings fan fiction in middle school, you might think that I like them too much. No further questions, please. What I don't like? Game of Thrones. So maybe the story is complex, maybe the characters are interestingly flawed, and yes, the production is super lavish, but it's nihilistic and it's unrelentingly dark, including the lighting. I mean, you think they would have included some lighting in the outsized budget, but apparently light bulbs are too expensive. Anyways, but don't we have a dim enough view of human nature already? Some say it's escapism, but I'm not trying to escape to a place darker than the one I'm in now, which is America in 2019. And then, don't get me started on all the fans who want to drone on to me about how incredibly accurate it is as a representation of the medieval era. There were no dragons. The medievals were actually kind of sophisticated. Speaking about that, it makes people boring. Game of Thrones just makes people insufferable. I'm incredibly excited that this is the final season, mainly because it means that soon, hopefully, people will just stop talking about it. You know how annoying it is when people analogize a political situation to Harry Potter? Like, how about, okay, it's Harry Potter, but depressed and with a lot of incest? Anyways, if even Donald Trump is using Game of Thrones memes, I think we should all just agree that it's over. Please.
You're going to get mail about that one.
Sorry, facts only.
Well said. I'm so with you. I tried to get through the first season, and I just couldn't at the end. It was just too dark, too much cruelty and gratuitous violence. Anyway, so let's think of happier things. Josh mentioned Notre Dame earlier, and I just want to say a word about it as well. I think one of the most notable things about the cathedral, especially in our time of instant reactions and instant news cycles, is just how it's the product of centuries of labor and love. And I love the quote from Victor Hugo, the great French novelist who was a great advocate of Notre Dame when it was in disrepair in the 19th century. And he wrote how the greatest productions of architecture are not so much the work of individuals as of community, or rather the offspring of a nation's labor, than the outcome of individual genius, the deposit of a whole people, the heaped-up treasure of centuries, the residuum left by the successive evaporations of human society, in a word, a species of formations.
For my rant, I want to congratulate Elizabeth Bruenig, who's not with us on the left this week, but who has received a big honor. She was a 2019 Pulitzer Prize finalist for feature writing. If you haven't read the feature she was recognized for, I recommend it. It's a sad but important and beautifully written piece that she wrote for the Washington Post about Amber Wyatt, a high school colleague of hers who was sexually assaulted and then seriously disserved by prosecutors and the community in the aftermath. One of the best things about the piece is how it shows a community in reflection, understanding the way that they collectively failed and trying to figure out how to do better in the future. It's very well deserved that Liz was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for this piece. That's all we have time for today. I want to thank Rich Lowry, Christine Emba, Ken White, and Igor Volsky. Left, Right, and Center is produced by Sarah Fay. Our technical director is JC Swadek. Katie Burskins and Colin Cab Washington are our production assistants. Adam Simon composed our theme music. I'm Josh Barrow. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next week for more Left, Right, and Center.
Download and subscribe at kcrw.com/LRC, the KCRW app, or wherever you find podcasts. Left, Right, and Center is produced and distributed by KCRW.
This season on Lost Notes from KCRW.
How does it feel to be like a girl playing an instrument? Well, how does it feel to be a man asking stupid questions? I mean, what...
Had I said no to this invitation from John Fahey, I would have for the rest of my life wondered what I had missed.
We're thinking about Billy Tipton at a very interesting time because I don't know that young people and older people agree on the meaning of trans.
I love you for the greatest, Sean. I love that it is an unholy album made with holy methods.
Once I wanted to be.
Hey everyone, I'm Jessica Hopper. I'm a music journalist, an author, and your host for Season 2 of Lost Notes. On Lost Notes, we look at music's untold stories. This season is packed. It's about legacies. How do they hold up? And how do they change over time?
Disco se aage literally means beyond disco.
Learn how, decades on, a song can find new meaning, something different than when it was written.
I just feel like it's objectifying women. Too long.
17 years old.
Yeah, now I'm 56, and it's freaking embarrassing.
Why is it embarrassing? You're 17 years old.
You can't just write it off as being 17 years old.
Hear from pioneering women who've been written out of music's history.
I get there, and the producer says, well, no, we're not doing your music. We have a script here, and we want you to do the sound.
Plus, find out what happens when we apply our 2019 politics to 1974's songs.
We didn't think about it as we were an all-girl band, we were out to prove a point. We just lived the music.
The first episode of this season of Lost Notes arrives April 25th. Subscribe now, wherever you get your podcasts.